Okay, welcome everyone to our second lecture in this series of lectures about disabilities and disorders. The one that we'll be talking about today is ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Probably one of the most common ones that you will come across, one that I think pretty much everyone will be familiar with. So you should not have to spend too much time researching this particular topic. I don't think it comes up too much in the assessments anyway, but it's definitely one to start wrapping your head around, because even if you're not working with the children who have a level of care requirements that is quite high, where they're on medication or undertaking therapy or those types of things, you do come across a lot of children who you would possibly think would fall into this category, although maybe not into the more serious level. So it's worth knowing as much as you can in this area, and especially knowing the types of strategies that are commonly used these days. Okay, so let's just get in there, these little pop-up things. So children with ADHD may find it difficult to stay focused on the task, be organised, and continuously move around. So what I always say when we're talking about disabilities is it really does depend on the person, and not only on the person, but obviously it depends on whether they have other disabilities and disorders, previous staff that have worked with them, the current context of where they're working in a loud multi-year rural class compared to a large class of 30 students in a suburb area. I mean, obviously students are not one and the same. They all act very differently, and in fact you'll notice kids with in one, say the Indonesian class, they'll behave in one manner, and then in the next class, in say English, they'll behave completely differently. Same in childcare centres and other special needs centres, if that's where you intend on working. So there are those personality differences, but typically and in general, there are some common traits that we see amongst people, children that have ADHD. Difficulty staying on task is probably the main one, or one of the two. The two main ones is difficulty staying on task, and that really, if you look at the actual term, that's where the A and the D come from, the first D there. So attention deficit. So attention is being able to stay focused, stay on task. For example, if you're talking to someone who has ADHD, they may be looking left, looking right, taking note of everything that's going on except for what you're trying to say. So their attention is elsewhere. You may sort of describe it as being off with the fairies. So the second part there, and deficit, of course. Deficit is just a word that means lacking in. So they're lacking in that ability to pay attention for any period of time, or they're paying attention to multiple things at the same time, but not really focusing on one thing and taking in all the information that they really need to, or that you would hope that they would. Hyperactivity as well. So the hyperactivity part means that they've got way too much energy for a classroom in most cases. So they will get out of their seat a lot and talk a lot, and they may try to distract other students a lot. So they're the type of behaviours that you'll commonly see. Okay, so if you combine those two things together, and that's the not being able to concentrate on one thing for very long, and combining that with wanting to always be moving around and doing something and being hyperactive, you get what is described as ADHD, the classical case of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But remember that, of course, it depends on the student, and they may have more of a case with the AD part and less with the HD, or vice versa. So of course that sentence there says stay focused on the task, that's the AD. being organised and continually moving around. So that continually moving around is more so the hyperactivity part. So just be aware of that, and quite often you'll see students, I always talk about with disabilities, about it being a bit of a spectrum, because there are some students who, if you were to rate them, say, out of 10, if there was such a scale, they might be a 1, but other students might be a 10, and then it gets a bit more complicated because you throw in the fact that they may be a 5 out of 10 for the AD bit, but for the HD bit, they may only be a 1 out of 10 or whatever. And I'm just making that sort of scale up to demonstrate it, but you can see that there is a bit of a spectrum, and it can also depend on the time of day, it can depend on the other students, which class they're in, what day of the week it is. Of course, even adults have problems concentrating when it comes 3 o'clock and they've had a big long day, or Friday at 2:30 and those types of things. So, bearing in mind that we do sometimes expect a lot from kids. Okay, we've already covered that. Obviously, ADHD stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and we've spoken about the fact that there's 2 parts to that. There's the attention deficit part, as in not being able to stay focused, and there's the hyperactivity part as well. Okay, so there are different types of ADHD. Don't be really too concerned with this. Until I saw this PowerPoint, which these PowerPoints are done by Kylie, another trainer that we have at FTTA. I never knew this, but realistically, this is just dividing the ADHD into the 2 sections that we were talking about just in the previous slide. So you've got the AD part and you've got the HD part. So we won't concentrate on that too much. And again, you see it uses that word predominantly, so that means mainly, I guess. So they can more so be the AD part but still have a bit of the HD, or they can more so be the HD part, so they're hyperactive, and less so the attention deficit. So what is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? One of the things that very much characterises it, which is in the actual name, is inattention. Easily distracted, not listening to your instructions, not focused on completing tasks, and quite often have poor organisational skills. And the reason they're poor organisational skills is because they're running around trying to do 10 things at once, or not being able to focus on one thing for longer periods of time, forgetting to do things, for example. So, and that's probably one of the main things that you'll notice, because that inattention, that distracted sort of behaviour, that's what gets kids in trouble a lot. So it means they want to stand up, it means they want to run around, it means they'll sit down, they'll answer 2 maths questions, they'll want to stand up, and they'll start looking around the room. And you'll be able to see it from a mile away, and because quite often these students will be on your radar, I suppose you could say, from day one. And they'll often, if you walk into a new school or childcare centre or wherever, other staff will tell you that Johnny is often misbehaving, or he's probably got ADHD. Quite often with ADHD, students don't have a formal diagnosis. It can be a lot harder to diagnose ADHD than some of the other disorders, because it can depend on a lot of different factors. One issue with ADHD is that the student has to exhibit the signs of ADHD, the symptoms of ADHD, at home as well as at school. Some kids are perfectly fine at home and only have these symptoms at school, which goes to show that it's not actually that is not actually the disorder that they have. It's they learned, or it's a behaviour they're exhibiting only in one location, whereas a disability or disorder is something that would be duplicated anywhere. So you can't be an amputee and be missing a leg in one spot but not missing a leg in another spot. If you've got that disability, then you've got that disability wherever you go. So it has to be, I guess, multi-locational, if that's a word. Impulsivity, so acting before thinking. And I think that comes down to, again, being easily distracted, doing one thing and their attention moving to another thing very quickly. I don't know if I would go as far as using that term, acting before thinking, but certainly um, um, the types of behaviours that you see quite often in classrooms that gets kids in trouble, like calling out, standing up and running around, going and talking to their friends, throwing things, that kind of stuff. Overactivity, constant restlessness, and fidgeting. And again, these little things where you see, if you notice that, a student is constantly fidgeting, one way to get around and to try and not necessarily solve, but to assist the students so that they can concentrate is to manage that fidgeting by putting something in their hand. That'll hopefully keep their attention, or at least deal with that fidgeting sort of need that they have so that they can concentrate on something else. And we were talking about this in the last lecture, and we'll probably cover it in most of these lectures. The sensory type objects that are used, these distraction sort of toys, we'll start talking about in a few slides from here, are very, very important and can certainly come in handy. And one way to think of it is what adults do when they're on the phone. So they're doodling and they're drawing little pictures, fidgeting with things, playing with the phone cord while they're talking on the phone, stuff like that. So even adults fidget, and there are reasons for it, because it does help us deal with situations and help people concentrate on a specific thing when they're having trouble focusing for long periods of time. Of course, with ADHD, we're not talking about focusing when it says an inability to focus or easily get distracted. We're not talking, kids will be kids, and sometimes kids will drink a 2-litre Coke before school or have a milkshake with heaps of sugar in it and stuff like that. So when we're talking about the level where it becomes a disorder, you're talking about a daily occurrence over a long period of time in multiple locations, under various different circumstances, regardless of whether they're interested in the topic or not. You're especially talking about attention deficit and hyperactivity to the point where it's seriously affecting their ability to learn, to pick up new skills, to socialise properly, to work in a classroom in a way that is acceptable under the rules and standard norms of a classroom or a childcare centre. So again, it's getting to the point where they're getting in trouble a lot. And of course, because everyone can be, from time to time, they can have a lack of attention, they didn't have enough sleep, parents have had a fight, whatever. But this is, when we talk about disorders, we're talking about when it's to the point of happening constantly, and not necessarily because of an external reason. So it's not because mum and dad had a fight, or it's not because you didn't have anything to eat for breakfast. It's an ongoing, constant, repetitive sort of thing. And the same with any other disorder or disability. It's not just something that happens for a week or two. It's an ongoing problem over the long term. Some facts. So as with the first lecture we did on autism and Asperger's, ADHD is neurological. So neuro means the brain, and is not a physical disorder. So it's not a disability. So it's not missing a leg or anything like that. It's something that happens in the brain. If you took and a way to explain that is that if you took a picture of someone with ADHD and a picture of someone without ADHD, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Does not affect your IQ. Some people might argue that, because if you're unable to concentrate at school for 12 years, I think that certainly would affect your IQ. But definitely, what they're saying here is that you're not genetically born being at a lower IQ. It's not a learning disorder per se. But of course, over the long term, if there are lots of issues with concentrating, if you're being suspended regularly, if the child is outside the classroom regularly, and even if they're missing 10% of their schooling, I mean, that's the equivalent of 1.2 years over a 12-year period. So you would probably find that, just at a guess, students that are diagnosed with ADHD do on average have a lower IQ if they were all measured at age 18. And that are probably the logical consequence of not being able to concentrate as much. I could be wrong there. ADHD is not caused by bad parenting, so it's not about discipline. But the main focus for kids with ADHD is coming up with strategies. So from our point of view as educational professionals is thinking through the strategies that work. There's no easy solution. It's not a problem that's going to go away overnight that can easily be solved by saying that mum and dad need to be more strict. Now, what is the difference between ADHD and ADD? Attention deficit disorder does not have the hyperactivity component. And of course, the hyperactivity is fidgeting, playing around a lot, getting up a lot, having to move around a lot, which all kids have, but to the point where it actually becomes a serious problem. I don't really hear of ADD much anymore these days. I'm not sure if that's just fallen out of fashion or it's just not really used in the medical sort of world, but ADHD is definitely the more common one. I was under the impression that ADD was the older sort of version, but it'd be worth looking that up for those if you're working with these kids. But from our point of view, I think just be aware that these terms exist, and given the strategies that you use at this sort of level, I don't think it really makes much of a difference. I think what you need to do is think through what works for that particular child, which will be different to the next child, and talk to parents, talk to the other adults involved, like the teachers or other more experienced DAs. Coming up with strategies that actually work is more important than worrying about the medical jargon. Okay, medication. And again, don't be too concerned with this. I don't expect you to memorize the different types of medication that are being used or anything to do with learning diagrams of how the brain works and this kind of stuff. It's not really important. As with the autism one, it's still going through a process where scientists are learning different things every day. There's always new ideas out there that you'll hear on TV and radio and whatnot. And the great thing about living in Australia is that from a medical research point of view, the Australian scientists and doctors do a fantastic world-class job. So we're always at the front end of a lot of this stuff, and quite often you hear things like Brisbane doctors come up with a new new process for this or a new medication for that. So number one, the first point here, neurotransmitters are brain chemicals. So they're things, well, I suppose you could say they're brain chemicals. They're things in your brain that connect by electrical pulses, and in a way that's sort of how the brain works. Now, the same with autism. We're talking about neurotransmitters and the research coming out saying, well, maybe the reason, one factor that gives students those ASD symptoms is because they have too many or too few neurotransmitters. So again, don't really be too concerned with what's going on there. Neuro means brain, essentially. Transmitters is electrical signals being moved around the brain. And of course, the second sentence there is relatively important. So with ADHD, it's about how quickly the brain receives this information and how that information moves around the brain. And that could have something to do with, obviously, being impulsive. Dexamphetamines and Ritalin. The dexamphetamine is probably, obviously is a term that you hear quite often. I think that's probably the more common one. that's used, because I've never seen that second word before, can't even pronounce it. But again, don't be too worried about these types of things. If you're looking after kids with ADHD, quite often you won't have to deal with any medication. And in fact, from an EA point of view or even a teacher point of view, I'd be almost refusing to anyway. There's a lot of risk there. Unless you're a qualified nurse or something like that, I certainly wouldn't be getting involved at that sort of level and with any of these type of things. Now, stimulants that release dopamine, which is your happy hormone, which affects the neurotransmitters. Number 3, non-stimulant drugs like Strattera may also be used. So there's a wide range, and I mean, I don't even know these chemicals or know what they do and that kind of stuff. Don't be too worried about these. You're not doctors. We're not doing a medical course. It's not really even relevant. But just be aware that kids do quite often take their medication before school or at lunchtime or whatever. The doctors will always be giving them different types of medication, upping it, going down a little bit and having different strengths. The only time you'll really need to, there's probably 2 reasons why you'll need to know that, talk about medication with kids. Firstly, they may have to go up to the front office or see a certain staff member to take their medication, so that may happen. But secondly, you may notice, and this happens all the time, a parent will take their kids off the medication, whether with doctor's support or not, and not inform the school. So out of nowhere, you'll rock up to school, normal day, Wednesday as usual, whatever, and this child that you normally get along with is just completely off the rails and uncontrollable, ends up being suspended. And that's because they've been suddenly taken off their medication completely for whatever reason. And that probably happens, I wouldn't say regularly, but it does happen. And quite often it's not the parents' fault necessarily. Sometimes kids just don't take their medication. Sometimes they've been sick. Sometimes doctors prescribe them something different, and it can take quite a number of years to figure out exactly what level or combination of medications will work. But I wouldn't be too concerned again about the medication side of stuff. We just cover it here just so that you know that it is very common with kids with ADHD. There are, of course, natural and alternative therapies. We won't go into these too much. Relaxation techniques such as yoga, breathing strategies, massage and Tai Chi. I do know that a lot of kids also do play football and or karate, those types of things. They have that outlet where they can run amok and get all the energy out of their system, and it also gives them a bit of a carrot at the end of the day. So if they're trying really hard to behave and so forth, then at the end of the day or whatever, then they have training for the football team or those types of things. So behaviour management, modification. So again, they're talking about therapies there. It's not necessarily involving drugs or anything like that. That's about, say, anger management classes, those types of things. That's all a type of behaviour management modification. Social stories would fall into that category. And diet, eliminating possible food triggers such as preservatives, additives, colours, and allergens, and vitamin supplements. We won't go into any of that stuff there. It's not really my place as far as this course goes to discuss any of these types of things, because they're really the abode of the parent and the doctors, and that's their sort of decision. But I do know of certain schools in America where and in Europe where they've taken kids who have serious ADHD type problems, put them into schools and removed all but super healthy food, no Coca-Cola, no nothing, and there are massively significant improvements in things like behaviour. So, and while that is an improvement, it doesn't necessarily mean that the ADHD goes away. And that those sort of experiments, they're talking about lots of different types of disabilities as well. But certainly, the point being that diet would certainly have some type of impact on behaviour, whether it's a child with a disability or without a disability. And the obvious example that I would give is when I was teaching some Year 11s, and I'd have this class in the morning, and they would be as nice a pie, no problem, and in the afternoon, after lunch, after drinking 2 litres of Coke and 3 Mars bars from the deli up the road, they would just be off with the fairies, and sometimes impossible. So food is not related to ADHD at all, these sort of comments, but food is something that certainly affects every person, and you may just need to be aware of that. And neurotherapy as well, which, if you want to go into more depth about that stuff, you can certainly do your research. There's a number of different therapies and techniques and things like that out there. There's dozens of them. Okay, so sensory resources. So again, we can think of sensory resources as ways for the child to distract themselves or to trick their brain into focusing on one particular thing. So that can be as simple as giving them, as it says in the middle one, they're giving them a fidget toy. Now, what that means is they can fidget with the toy, play around with it in their hands, and something like a little, like a juggling ball. And they can move that around in their hands, and that will reduce the need for them to be distracted and to be looking up and left and right and talking to Johnny and jumping up and down. And it's not going to work for every student, but it is obviously going to have some type of effect in some cases. And again, with all these different types of strategies, it's just important to try different things. So we go through a list later on for ADHD of all the things that might work, and sometimes they might work straight away, and other times they may not work, and then other times the strategy may work for a week and then stop working completely. So just bear this in mind as we talk through different things, that again, all of these disorders and disabilities are on a spectrum, and the types of behaviours vary quite remarkably. And then you start combining those behaviours with other disorders or symptoms and signs of other disorders and disabilities as well, and it can get a lot more difficult to narrow it down and be specific. So just be aware, we cover the basics here, but in the real world, things are obviously a lot more dynamic. Okay. Distracted or distracting surroundings. The environment can be a big influencing factor on the behaviour and educational success of the student. Distractions may include displays that move around, so a display sort of near a window or something like that. A fan moving around, those types of things. Where the student is sitting in the classroom, seating plans are super important. Other students in the classroom, and not so much other students in the classroom, but the types of noises and distractions and what's going on in the classroom as well. So if that kid, for example, is being bullied and he's sitting right next to a group of people that bully him or her, then obviously that would be quite distracting, and the level of anxiety would be quite high. And as with adults, if we're anxious, if we're scared, it's pretty hard to learn something. Windows provide lots of daydreaming opportunities. I don't think that necessarily means that you want to start blackening all the windows out and start working in a cave or anything. So I'm not sure specifically why that one's in there, but it is bearing in mind that any distractions where you can minimise distraction if possible, is necessary. And again, that comes down to the seating plan. So putting the student that has ADHD, that's always off task and needs a lot of extra assistance, putting them at the back corner might not necessarily be the best place. An open door where traffic's going past, so people constantly moving backwards and forth. Changes in weather, such as rain on the roof, that's very much a ASD type thing. So an area with less distractions, both visual and noise, is important to allow students to focus, and that goes with adults as well. So bearing in mind that some adults, some students can concentrate really well with a bit of music on, and others it drives them absolutely insane. Some people need to be in complete silence to be able to concentrate on anything, whereas others are quite happy working, sitting at the local coffee shop, typing away on their laptops, doing plenty of work. So it really is an individual thing, and you need to experiment and just see what works for that particular child and play around with it, because strategies they don't work forever. They generally have a limited lifespan. But in saying that, you can train students, so students will learn how to behave over a longer period of time, even though the strategies, the consequences, and things like that may change. Okay, impulsive behavior. The brain of a child with ADHD reacts at speeds faster than people who don't have ADHD. People without ADHD have time to think about consequences before applying their actions. So that basically means, in very simplistic terms, that a child with ADHD will, for example, call out or jump out of their seat, and those types of behaviours, whereas a neurotypical or a normal sort of person without ADHD might say to themselves, maybe I'll go talk to Johnny over there. No, I think I'll stay here and do some work because otherwise I'll get in trouble. Whereas a person with ADHD won't actually go through that thought process. That's the sort of the basics of what we're getting at when we talk about impulsive behavior. And that obviously has consequences for how you manage that child. If you're thinking about whether it's a behavioral issue that they can control, or that you need to help them learn to control that behavior, or if they're actually, it is very different to a student who may sit back and think, I'm going to do this regardless of what the rule is because I just don't care. Okay, and therefore a child with ADHD may more often do something dangerous, as in behaving without thinking. If you're on an excursion, for example, make more mistakes, act inappropriately, get out of their seat more often, and call out answers. When we think of an idea, we have a buffer for most of our reactions. And I think that buffer, what they mean there is a time buffer. So we may stop and think for, say, a millisecond. But without this buffer, that can obviously cause problems. Alrighty, I'll just get all of these things to come up so we can get a nice overview. Okay, poor organizational skills can cause an ADHD child to be constantly reprimanded. Reprimanded just means you're being in trouble. So that can mean, for example, forgetting pens and pencils, or doing the homework the night before but forgetting to bring it to class, things like that. Using visual organizational resources allows the child to be more independent with less consequences. Now that is a fancy little kid way of saying have a to-do list, really. Visual organization resources. So a to-do list, and it can be little pictures and things like that. This is a positive tool that allows a child to follow the tricky classroom structure, because there are a lot of things that students and kids have to remember. What to do when you walk into a class. You've got to talk in a certain way. You've got to sit down quietly. You've got to do it in a certain amount of time. You have to walk in a certain path, and so on and so forth. Okay, now there's some just little pictures and some little activities that you may see with children with, well, any disorder really, but especially ADHD. Now, the very bottom one, obviously bottom right there, is a checklist. So is the left, in fact, a schedule. And you can see that it's timed out and there's routines. Now, routines are one of the best ways, especially visual routines, one of the best ways to help manage students that have disabilities and disorders. The top right there is a very interesting one, the timer. So letting students know, and this relates back to the schedule too, and the to-do list on the bottom right, letting students know you've got 15 minutes to do this, or you've got 10 minutes to do that. Or if we work on our maths questions flat out for 10 minutes, quietly and in silence, then we get 10 minutes to play outside. as just an example. And you may eventually work them until they get to the stage where it's, okay, we're going to work for 15 minutes now, and you can play outside for 8 minutes, and so on. And sticking to that time to the exact second is very important. Alrighty, strategies for EAs. Plan for success with a focus on positive non-verbal strategies. So planning for success, a focus on positive, and I think if you've read the behaviour management chapters, the positive, that word positive comes up a lot. And is very important because for your own stress as well. So if you're managing students with a very negative, stressful sort of outlook, yelling, screaming, carrying on like that, obviously your day is going to be stressful. You'll finish the day and be very stressed, and you might not stay in that job for very long. So I think having a positive outlook is extremely important, but also having the strategies and processes that we were talking about in previous lectures and the ASD lecture as well. So having a plan, knowing what you're going to do is very important. Thinking about Josh is misbehaving all the time, but what specifically is he doing, and how often is he doing it, and how can we reduce it? So if Josh is getting out of his seat every 10 minutes on average, every 15 minutes, then how can we reduce that down to every half hour? And should we reward that every half hour? Should we have a positive consequence? Where if he doesn't do it for a whole hour, then maybe he gets a bit of extra playtime or something like that. But whatever works. And then over a period of time, of course, you can continue to work on that. And sometimes for EAs, people might say, well, we shouldn't, reward bad behaviour, this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, you want to survive the day. You want to get to the end of the day with the child doing as much work as possible or learning as much as possible, and you being as less stressed as possible. So that I guess is one way to think of it. So fidget toys is a good sort of distraction and can definitely help. I know a lot of schools in some circumstances, let kids use the MP3 players, especially, and quite often the other kids are usually very understanding. They know that you have a special sort of contract with Josh because he's always misbehaving or he's got a disability or whatever. And in my experience, kids are actually very, very accepting and understanding. I know in the media they portray kids as being bullies and picking on special needs kids and stuff like that, but I've actually found that very, very rarely, if ever, to be the case. Regular gross physical movement sessions after a lesson or during a lesson, a few minutes movement is lots of fun. So for example, if you've got Year 9 students and you're taking, say, 3 of them, try and, in a different room, say going through some spelling or something, try and figure out a way to get them standing up and moving a little bit. Not too hyperactive because you want them to sit back down, but always build in a bit of movement. And to give you an example, I've seen teachers and EAs before getting the kids to be the ones that do note-taking. So they're the ones that actually on the board are writing up notes or cleaning the board or writing out the answers as other kids are calling them out and things like that. So you're getting them involved, but you're actually getting them to do physical stuff, and that can significantly help them because quite often if these children aren't misbehaving for the sake of misbehaving, they're just very hyperactive, then getting them involved in the class where they're successful and they're actually contributing can be a great motivator. And we all know that people who are motivated and people who have a positive self-efficacy, so they feel good about themselves, they feel confident, then they're willing to have a go. And as with adults, if you think you're not very good at something, you're going to avoid it. So if you're not very good at painting or cooking, then you'll certainly avoid painting or cooking and try and get other people to do it. And the same with kids. If they think they're going to fail, if they think they're not very good at maths, for example, then they'll avoid it. And quite often the only strategy they know, the only way they know to avoid it, to get out of it, is to get in trouble because then they get sent away. Hands-on learning tasks. So by hands-on, we're talking about tactile, we're talking about kinesthetic, fidgeting with things, playing with things, teaching skills through physical objects. So if you're doing counting, getting the blocks out, getting the pencils out and counting pencils, those types of things. And of course you can be real creative, even if you're just wandering around the class or the childcare centre and they're doing their activities, how can you get them to be more creative instead of doing the maths problem or whatever using their pencil? How can they actually do that problem being a bit more hands-on? Even if it's just a part of that problem, being a bit more hands-on and then building up to the one that they're actually on, going back to the basics. Group working with talking, so structured outlet for them to not only get the attention that a lot of kids crave, but also the peer interaction, the social skills they'll build from that. They learn things like turn taking and sharing and following other people's lead and negotiation and things like that. So group work is a very important part of everyone's development. And if you think about even someone like a computer technician these days, does a lot of work in small groups and in large groups. And if you're working for IBM or you're working as just a network technician for a business or something like that, then they're obviously working with all the staff and asking them about what problems they had and those types of things. So even those jobs that we traditionally think are very, I suppose, lonely, isolated jobs, that's certainly not the case anymore. And everyone needs, to survive these days, needs to learn how to work with others. So developing those social skills from an early age is always a good thing. A quiet working area for tasks that require concentration or even just to practice. So as a strategy, having a concentration session type of thing where you're just practicing concentrating on things for 20 minutes or 15 minutes without being distracted could be very helpful. And even if it's concentrating on something that they're very, very interested and focused on, at least at the end they've successfully concentrated on something. They were successful, so that they're slowly learning that they can actually concentrate. It really just depends on the content, and then they can start applying those skills in other areas that they don't find as interesting. Just as an idea there, but you can see there are plenty of strategies out there. You can be as creative as need be. Every child's going to be different. Every teacher's going to have different systems that you've got to work within. There'll be different topics. You may be working in a phys ed class, which would bring its own sort of issues, or you may be working in an English class, or you may be working with year ones. Obviously, the maturity levels would and developmental levels would significantly affect the type of strategies that you were using to help those children. But just bear in mind, you're circulating around the class or in a childcare centre, kids with ADHD, think in advance what you would use, how you're going to help them. If you're in a childcare centre or kindy, for example, and you're going to sit down for 20 minutes and read a book, make sure that you've got some objects that you can pass around, and the child that usually loses their attention, they can play and sort of fidget with that object or hold on to it for you while you're reading the story. And you can pass objects around that are related to the book, for example. And it may take a little bit more of effort, but it does prevent a lot of problems. And if that doesn't work, then at least you've tried something, and next time you can try something different. Some more strategies here: visual reminders. So you may not need to remember the bump method. There's those bump 1 and 2. You may not need to necessarily be yelling and screaming at kids, but those lower sort of bump methods. The first one, obviously, just the look and the stare. And maybe just a single word like "Josh, please," something like that, or pointing to a poster on the wall that says "quiet." So little visual reminders, and of course, then you get to save yourself for working with other children. So if there's one person that's a little bit off task, instead of moving away from one group that you're working with to deal with a behaviour issue which has educational consequences for the group you were with. Organisation lists to prepare for the day, visual timetable, quiet working area, less visual distractions, away from doors and windows, and again have the IEP and IBP, which isn't really too concerning at the moment. I think if you're having significant problems with a particular student, then that's worth having that discussion with other staff about their IEP or IBP, or what type of plan is in place, or usually something somewhere, if it's called something slightly different, written on paper that's got some goals on it, some activities that work, so the triggers, the maybe the medication they're on. Parents might let you know, what they do at home to get them to, for example, do the chores and things like that. So you might learn little things that can certainly help. All right, and here's a few sites that you may want to go to, but I'm more inclined just to figure out exactly what you're looking for. I mean, ADHD is a general search. Obviously, the first thing that will pop up in Google would probably be Wikipedia, but I would be thinking type something a bit more specific if there's an area that you're interested in within the ADHD context. But there are 3 sites that we have used and some of our students go to. As far as their studies is concerned, but there are hundreds of them out there. So as with anything, make sure you get multiple opinions. Don't listen to anything I say. Don't listen to anything your friends try and tell you, or teachers, or whoever. Get a bigger picture. Get an all-round sort of picture, and take advice from multiple sources, and then apply that to the particular situation that you're working with. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed that lecture. Again, we've only covered the very, very, very basics of ADHD, a little bit about the medicines, a little bit about the diagnosis, a little bit about the different types of ADHD, and quite a lot about the strategies and what works and doesn't work. And hopefully you're starting to see that regardless of the disability, the strategies and the way you manage those children, the things you can do in the class are common to various different disabilities, disorders, especially all the neurotypical ones. So they all involve the brain, I guess. So there's not necessarily any physical tools that you'll need to use, any equipment and those types of things.